Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. Today, I'm joined by James Valliant, Dr. Samuel Zinner, and Dr. Robert M. Price. And we're going to be talking about redating the four Gospels to the 2nd century AD. And this discussion will also heavily involve the Bar Kokhba period. And this will get into a lot of that will involve the Gospel of John, but also involve the Gospel of the Lord, which is attributed to Marcion. And we're also going to be talking about Marcion priority in that context. I think I'd like to start this off by asking Dr. Samuel Zinner, what led to you to your conclusion that the Gospel of John was heavily influenced by the Bar Kokhba revolt? And how do you see Marcion fitting into that? Because in the 2nd century, you have a text called the Anti-Marcionite Prologue, and I would like Dr. Price to comment on this as well. That says that Marcion had read John shortly after it was published, insinuating that that John was written around the time of Marcion's first exile, because he was excommunicated twice. The first time from a small church, and the second time from a larger excommunication from the Roman Church when he traveled to Rome a few years later, 144. And they excommunicated him as well.
Sounds like the Roman Church was really offended about something there, because contrary to popular claims, right, we know that, for instance, Valentinus was actually never excommunicated by Rome, right? So that's just an old myth that we can get rid of. Right. Anyway, I don't know if the Gospel of John was heavily influenced by the whole period of Bar Kokhba, but I do see, especially in chapter 5, some intriguing evidence, right? That there's a reference to Bar Kokhba when Jesus is made to say that he's come, I'm paraphrasing, he's come in his Father's name. Someone else is going to come in their own name. Right. Well, you don't receive me, but someone else will come in their own name, and him you will not receive. Right now, back in, I believe, a 1908 publication by Paul Schmidl, he maybe, I don't know if he was the first one, but he maybe was the first scholar to suggest that that was actually an allusion to Bar Kokhba. And that intrigued me several years ago. So the problem was that Schmidl really doesn't give any supporting evidence. Right. So just because one scholar thinks that Bar Kokhba is being alluded to, right, really there's not much to go on. So what I did was just simply look at what comes before and after in that, not only the pericope, but the entire chapter. Right? Are there any other signs that could be interpreted as echoes or allusions, right, to Bar Kokhba, the person, or the events? Right. And so that's where it's the case I came up with is not open and shut, it's not definitive, but I think it's what my German friend Bernhard Long would call suggestive, right? And that is in that section you have some of the perhaps the highest statistical rate in the Gospel of John, right, for verbs like aqua, for here, right? And there's also this concept of witness or witnessing, right? Regardless of it being the noun or the verb. And this in Greek, right? The words that would be used are actually then cognate, right, with the English word for martyr, right? So martyr is someone who witnesses. Right? Anyway. So what does that have to do with Bar Kokhba, hearing and witnessing, right? And it's these are theological terms in John, right? Especially hearing and witnessing. But after chapter 5, right, most of the instances of hearing, right, go back to a non-theological valence. It's no longer some trope about the duty to hear God or hearken or obey God, but it's more like, well, so-and-so heard someone say this, and they had some conversation, right? Anyway, so if you think of Bar Kokhba, his actual name was Shimon, which is from it's cognate to the Hebrew verb for to hear, right? And significant because every day, as you probably know, right, Jews recite or say the Shema. This is the first line is in Deuteronomy 6:4. That's where it opens. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And yes, I'm traditional. I don't say the Tetragrammaton. So the point is that David Hendon came up on this idea independently of me. So it was a happy discovery of mine after I presented and published this idea. And that is that on the Bar Kokhba coins, where you have the name Shimon abbreviated, right, using only the first three letters, Shin, Mem, Ayin, right? When you look at that, that's the Hebrew imperative for Shema, hear, O Israel. So it's the first word of the Shema Yisrael. So Hendon, who's one of the world's greatest coin experts, his argument is that this is intentional, and Shimon Bar Kokhba did this so that when people saw his abbreviated name on his coinage during the war, they would associate his name with the Shema, with the daily proclamation, right, of Jewish monotheism, right, to give you a mouthful there. And so that's the importance of hearing, right, Shema. So you hear, Israel must hear, right, that the Lord, our God, the Lord is one, right? And the witnessing comes in there because if you look at any traditionally written Torah scroll in that verse, right, the third and last letter of the verb Shema, right, so this is the first word in that pasuk or that verse, is an ayin, right, and it's written larger than the surrounding letters. Now you go to the end of the pasuk, the end of the verse, the last word is a had, and the last letter of that is dalet, right? So it corresponds to the sound of D, right? The fourth letter in A, B, C, D, in English, and it's the fourth letter also in the abjad systems, the abjad alphabets like Hebrew, the original form of Arabic. And so the rabbis point out that then you're supposed to join these two letters, which are written larger than all the other surrounding letters, the ayin and the dalet, which gives you an acronym. It gives you a Hebrew word for, it's the noun for witness. And so the idea is you should be willing to lay down your life, be a martyr, right, rather than deny the truth of this statement of monotheism. Right? And famously, Rabbi Akiva, of blessed memory, right, did this when he was being martyred by the Romans. Right, the last thing on his breath, and every Jew prays that this will be the last words on their mouth, and that is the Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Right, and so it's very interesting that not only in the Gospel of John, but also in the first letter of John, also in the book of Revelation, which is written by not the same person, but someone who belongs to a trajectory that overlaps in certain ways with the community or whoever, the circle that the author of the Gospel of John belonged to. They all have this constellation of witnessing, hearing, and also doing the commandments, right, or doing these things, right, which is a couple verses down from Deuteronomy 6:4 in the first paragraph of the Shema. So, to me, it becomes suggestive, right? That it is possible. In fact, it's probably likely that John 5 is alluding to Bar Kokhba as the one who will come in his own name, but the Jews will not receive. Hello, Markus.
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry because I'm in Tenerife at the moment, and somehow the timing I got wrong because it's a different time zone. It's the Dublin one.
Oh, it happens. It's fine. Welcome in.
Well, I was just answering a question for Jacob about why I think the Gospel of John is to be dated after the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And I sort of wrapped that up, and then he had a follow-up point, which I'll only comment on very briefly, and that's the question of Marcion. And there, I'll defer to the other speakers. I'll only say that Personally, again, this is a question that I'm maybe not agnostic on, but I don't think we have definitive knowledge about so many things. And so, even though I doubt the historicity of the Marcion prologue that associates Papias with the Gospel of John, I find it completely congruent with the evidence to posit that there is an anti-Marcionite program that we can see in the Gospel of John. Let's put it that way. So.
May I just ask again? So when would you date the Gospel of John?
Well, far be it for me to give an actual date, but of course, right? I could only say, well, it would be. I would imagine it'd be sometime after the Bar Kokhba revolt begins, to anytime thereafter, right? And then, of course, we'd have to look at the evidence, and of course, you could narrow down how long. It's not going to be a century after that, right? But it's going to be between Bar Kokhba's actual activity or Shimon's actual activity, because there's a big question about, right, the title Bar Kokhba, right, where that originates from, if Shimon actually claimed to be the Messiah, or is this a later rabbinic? So let all of that to the side, which I'm perfectly happy to talk about if you want me to. But to somewhere not too long after the end of the revolt.
Because what we've got, of course, is that we know from Irenaeus that Ptolemaeus has written a commentary on the preface, on the first chapter of John. So that
helps us narrow it down too.
A fixed date, yeah. So we have at least, it must be before 150 something.
Yes.
So that would give us a window of about 10, 15 years between, let's say, 138, 140, and 150, 55 maybe. So I think that's the
I
only
would narrow
thing
it down to about 140, actually. If you want to corner me, that's what I would say, always circa, since I don't have a time machine.
And that's why I think it's so interesting to have this kind of Marcionite prologue, or anti-Marcionite prologue rather, which associates Marcion with John. So whether or not we take it as a seriously historical fragment, but at least it coincides, giving the time framing that's being reflected in the fragment. That is exactly the time frame which is given, as you just mentioned, between 100, let's say, 40 and a bit of 50. Yeah.
Professor, yes. Do you see Marcionite ideas in any way being sort of ironed over or integrated in the Johannine literature?
I do think so. Look, right at the beginning, well, we've got, which is in one way Marcionite, in that it skips all the birth stories, so it doesn't know of any kind of historicized Jesus. In contrast, I think it sides with Marcion by having it as a divine figure, almost as an angelic figure. And then we have even a literal parallel when John says that the Logos has come down. And then I think it is a sort of anti-Marcionism, if we want to take that, when he says in John that he doesn't come, or that he hasn't been received by his own. While Marcion was saying, well, the word isn't his own, right? So he couldn't have been received by the people, and that's exactly how Marcion's gospel starts. I mean, he's been rejected in Nazareth, he's been rejected in Capharnaum, or first Capharnaum and then Nazareth, and this is in a different way. It's being explained in John that the Logos comes down from above, right, as in Marcion's gospel, and that it was not received. But the word, despite all the hostility which John associates with the word is bad, there's the demon, the Satan, and all things are around here associated with materialism, right? Whereas still he makes a claim And I think this is the kind of anti-Marcionite claim that the creator of this cosmos in John still is not just the devil, or it's not just an evil demiurge. It's still something of some kind of goodness. And I think this is a response to Marcion, who dissociated that. So when I published my book on Christ's Torah, in English in next year, I think, I'm making the claim that John's gospel is somehow halfway between the synoptics and Marcion. And that we can see, for example, also how he deals with the John the Baptist, where John the Baptist is, as in the synoptics, some kind of a bridge between the old prophets and the new prophets. And yet it's not the same John as we have it in the synoptics. Just need to put on back to the earplugs because my daughter is doing DIY stuff here in the house.
I'm going to pull up this super chat question. Amos Wedenberg, thank you for the super chat. Why didn't any flavor, I think he meant to say favor, of Christianity value? Oh, okay. No, he did say flavor. Okay. Why didn't any flavor of Christianity value Hebrew scripture enough to have its own textual transmission of the text in the Hebrew only XLL? I think you meant to spell LXX, a Septuagint.
Only textual.
Anybody good answer?
Oh, I'm still not clear, even if that means the Septuagint there.
Yeah, I don't get it either.
But we can just look at the first part of the question then.
Okay.
Well, if no one else wants to go for it, I'm happy to.
He's quiet, yeah.
All right. Well, I would say that this this has to do with the whole issue of what's called the Gentile Mission, right? So Paul's contribution, right, to the early Jesus movement. Statistically speaking, right, you're going to have more. Pretty soon, you're going to have more Gentiles or non-Jews than Jews, right, in this Jesus movement, and then compounded by the fact of what some scholars would actually classify as genocide, right? Not necessarily the first Jewish war, but right. So the persecution of Jews during the first Jewish war, then the Kaitos War in 115 to 117, but then the Bar Kokhba revolt. And what happened there in the Bar Kokhba revolt, there is where many comparative genocide scholars would classify what Rome did to Jews as an actual genocide. So I'll answer this by bringing up an anecdote. A comparative religions scholar, Karen King, wrote in a letter in one of the major world newspapers some years ago that Paul's message won out over James's message, or the message of so-called Jewish Christianity, because Paul's theology was the more theologically profound, right? Which is a terrible argument, in my opinion, because it totally overlooks, right, the role of Roman decimation of Jews, right, and of including those who would have been identifying themselves as or circulating within this emerging Jesus movement. So the reason Paul won out was just a statistical matter, right? That if this movement is then open to Gentiles, right, and just not Jews, it's going to be natural that Gentiles are going to predominate in numbers, and I believe that's what happened, and that's why maybe there were early Hebrew writings, right? We don't really know of any, but maybe there were. But certainly, the fact that there aren't any in the records, and that I think would be because of the situation I stated.
So you see the Bar Kokhba revolt in effect as stamping out whatever's left of the quote circumcision party within Christianity.
Well, not totally, because we do know, right, that interest in Judaism on the part of followers or members of the Jesus movement are continued for quite some time. Now, of course, some of those, right, may even have been, Gentiles who had some attraction to Judaism, right? So this may be the case with some of the authors of the Syrian pseudo-Clementine literature, right? And,
But also, let me,
sure, yes, please, Mark.
if you want me to come in, yeah. I think the question should also be rephrased a bit, because I think not just Christians rejected or didn't use much of the Hebrew script or didn't write much in Aramaic. A good number of Jews did not either. I mean, we know from Josephus, he claims to have written in Aramaic or Hebrew. Philo of Alexandria claims that. Whatever Paul did, we don't know. Other stuff than what we've got. So let's say the major proponents of Jews and Judaism, if we want to use the term Judaism at all for this time period, and is an intellectual Greek-oriented form of Jewish practice. And those people who later become subsumed under the title of Christians derive predominantly from this type of a Greek learning or learned type of Jewish practice. So it's not that much that it is a typical feature of Christians. It is a typical feature of a particular form of Hellenistic Jewish culture, which is the culture which nurtures the area on which Christians are the breeds, but not just Christians. I mean, what's more interesting is that probably the question needs to be flipped to its top by saying, how does it happen that so many Greek-speaking Jews are first preserved exclusively by Christians, and why so few Greek-writing Jews continue to write Greek and without becoming Christians?
What an excellent point. I think we have to think of Jews living as basically Greek-speaking by our Roman period. I mean, I'm not saying that they didn't have rabbis and scholars who were well-versed in their ancient languages, but I just have to think that the ordinary Jewish merchant in Alexandria, basically, if he was literate at all, he was literate in Greek, Koine Greek of the period. And
exactly.
So I think you did it right, Professor Vinzent. I think we sort of should flip the question. Of course, it's natural for especially our more Hellenized Jews in the Eastern Mediterranean to be working in this Greek cultural context rather than the opposite, in fact.
Yes. Well, even the Hebrew speaking, which I believe Hebrew was a living language at the time, so I'm in a minority here. But even, let's say, even the Semitic speaking Jews of the time were also Hellenized. We can't overlook that. In fact, there's a good argument to be made, right, that the Tanakh was divided into 24 books in order to imitate Homer. So, and there are some good arguments, I would say some good essays that have been published relatively recently. Some scholars arguing that Greek would have been Jesus' language of teaching, right? So we don't need to look for supposed errors.
The picture that's drawn, at least in the Gospels, and we'll just leave it at that, as the picture drawn in the Gospels, is that he's a sort of itinerant preacher, in Galilee, maybe around the Sea of Galilee, talking to ordinary folks. Wouldn't Aramaic be the natural language of choice there at that time?
Depends on the region. In some regions where they speak of him, he would have been speaking in Greek, I would think.
Nazareth, for example, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Tiberius.
Yes.
Right, or Sepphoris, perhaps, right?
Yeah, so so the whole trajectory in an earlier phase of New Testament scholarship, which would look for signs of mistranslation, right? The Greek text, and see signs of mistranslation from Aramaic or Hebrew. A lot of that looks a little naive now, I think, to many scholars.
I deny that Josephus wrote different. Josephus suggests repeatedly that he wrote in the languages of Aramaic, presumably a version of his works. Do you deny that?
Me?
Yeah, you suggested that you deny.
No, I believe that he actually did. right, writing in a Semitic language. Yes, and this is a very contentious, very controversial subject, but there has, I think, been a relatively recent breakthrough, and you'll see what I mean, and that is in the recent Blackwell companion to Josephus, right? I believe there's what I would call a major chapter by Kate Lemming, right, who is arguing that the Slavonic Josephus represents that original Semitic language version of Josephus with a lot of, I would say, two layers of interpolations, and that is early Christian interpolations, which are probably from somewhere in the late 100s, early 200s, somewhere around there, and then, of course, a secondary layer of medieval interpretation that would have been added by the Slavonic scribe. But Lemming presents a really plausible, not only plausible, but I think powerful arguments. One of them being that all of the glosses that we see in the Greek version that explain Jewish terms for the sake of the pagan or non-Jewish audience are absent from the Slavonic version. And so is the entire introduction. Yeah, the introduction that was designed for the non-Jewish reading audience. So anyway, before this article by Lemming, most scholars just totally ignore the significance of Slavonic Enoch. I don't think we really can. And I've mentioned this before to Jacob in one of my interviews, and that is, for instance, even though there is a certain rhetorical technique that tries to water this down, nevertheless, it's clearly present in the Slavonic version that this version is portraying Jesus and John the Baptizer as seditious rebels.
See, that's
and they
it.
preach word for word what Ari teach in the Greek version.
See, in the Slavonic edition, it's kind of clear John the Baptist is just an outright rebel, and Jesus is associated with the rebel movement and thought to be a rebel in a way that Christian literature would not later present him. And that sort of creates a credibility to that version, actually. Later Christians wouldn't put it that way. And what the Pilate story contained therein is anti-canonical. I have a hard time imagining that a later Christian would invent a story about Pilate that simply never shows up in later Christian literature. It's heretical, in effect. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, though that's actually one of Lemming's arguments.
Right.
These differences and many of the what are obviously Christian interpolations in the Slavonic version, even those, right, are not orthodox, and they are so strange that the best way to date them, right, would actually be quite early. They're ancient interpolations, in other words.
Well, why would we, let me be so bold as to make this assertion. If we're going to go with the revived Eisler argument here on the Slavonic edition of Josephus, why not go full bore? Why not?
Well, because Lemming's not going there. She'd be the first to distance herself from Eisler.
But why don't we open that up again and suggest that perhaps Josephus, what sounds like an expanded version of the Testimonium that we'll later read in the Antiquities, is there. But wait a minute, maybe it was our questioning of the language of the Antiquities Testimonium that's the primary grounds for thinking that the Slavonic edition is an interpolation. Maybe both are fundamentally original to Josephus. What about that?
Anyone join in here? I don't want to be the only one speaking, right?
No,
but
no, please go ahead.
Right. Well,
everyone on that.
You'd have to take them separately. You have to look at both of these versions of the Testimonium separately. Now, the first version in Greek, right? Everyone has their own opinion. Mine is again a minority opinion, but it's supported by a recent article that I've discussed before. In interviews with Jacob, which I actually believe the whole thing is authentic. There are no interpolations. It's only been just completely, essentially misunderstood because scholars, including average readers, have forgotten the audience. He's not addressing Jews.
If I could just stop right there. It seems to me that the primary argument that the Slavonic edition is clearly an interpolation is sort of dependent on the idea that the language of the Antiquities Testimonium have been tampered with. If, as you say, the testimonium in the Antiquities is effectively intact linguistically, doesn't that remove the main objection to thinking that the Slavonic edition has been interpolated as well?
For me, it would, as well as Lemming, but we would still see a certain amount of Christian tampering in the Slavonic parallel to what appears in the Jewish wars in the Greek. But anyway, so my point was, for instance, when the Greek text says that, well, this person, I'm paraphrasing, this person I'm talking about, right, this was Ha Christos. So this is not to be understood as the Messiah. This is to be understood as a personal name. He's previously mentioned the Jewish name of this individual, Jesus, and now for his Greek-speaking audience, for his non-Jewish audience, he's saying, oh, by the way, this Jew I'm telling you about, whose name is Jesus, this is the man you're hearing about everywhere called Christ. Right, and so the definite article there would not be translated in English, of course. Right, we don't say the Robert, the Samuel, right, as is the case in Greek. Right, and so if you keep in mind the Jewish audience, then there's really nothing problematic in the Greek testimonium anymore. Even the thing about was he? If you can even call him human, right? The implication of divinity. This is a very common Greek idiom, right? And Greco-Hellenistic literature, it just simply means an extraordinary person, right? And so, in the infancy gospel of Thomas, right, the enemies of Jesus say, well, we don't know if this is a human, an angel, or a god, right? But he should be put up on a big cross. Right, and then St. John Chrysostom talks about Elias, Elijah, and says, if we can even call him a man, right? So the implication is just not some kind of Protestant or Catholic doctrine of divinity of the Messiah. It's simply a Greek idiom that means an extraordinary individual. Now, if you move to the Slavonic parallel to the testimonium, which is in the Jewish war, not because there is no Slavonic antiquities, right? But in the Jewish war, it's quite a bit longer. And if you keep in mind that it's a Jewish audience as well, I think you can still, it's easy to identify some interpolations in there. So I do think there are interpolations in that Slavonic version, but I don't see any in the Greek. It's just
but the substantial story, that is to say, of Pilate at first forgiving Jesus, but then having to bring him back, which we don't find in the Gospels, that essential story you see as being original to Josephus.
Well, that's a different Jesus, though. But some scholars have argued that Jesus, son of Ananus, right, that story has some uncanny parallels to the synoptic gospel, the passion story of Jesus, right? And even some evangelical Protestant scholars have argued this. It's just like, well, we don't know what's going on, but there's obviously some kind of literary relation.
I like to jump in there real fast because sure. I think Professor Eisenman, actually he does. At one point he compared Barabbas with Jesus, son of Ananus, in Josephus. I think the reason is because they were both named Jesus that were released by a Roman governor. Although it's 30 years apart, Eisenman seems to think, or he seems to imply that the Barabbas story is a reworking of the Jesus ben Ananus story in Josephus.
Well, also Theodore J. Whedon did a fascinating comparison of over 20 major and minor parallels between all four gospel passion narratives and the Jesus ben Ananias story, including like when the Roman governor says, "Where are you from?" etc., etc., etc. He says there are too many of these things just in common to say that, well, that's just the same sort of a story. No, it looks like Wheaton thought either that the story of Jesus ben Ananias was known so far and wide that the four gospel writers used it, or and I would lean in this direction that no, they all got it from Josephus. And independently, and I had already suggested that without all the argumentation in my book, Deconstructing Jesus, but I still stick by that. I mean, that's one place where Ralph Ellis identifies another Jesus with the gospel Jesus, where I think he's right on target.
Well, so then if the Gospels, if we can establish that the Gospels are dependent on Josephus, haven't we gone a long way in proving that the Gospels really must be second century doctrine?
Amen.
Well, not all the way, but yeah, it was certainly would have, if you can show dependence on the later work, especially the Antiquities, then the question is, well, how long would it take, more or less, for some Christian author to digest, this huge work, right, that's just been published by Josephus, right, and to work it around in their mind and then create their own writings. So who knows how long that would take, but I think it would take quite a bit of time for me, because the Antiquities is massive. But and my understanding would be that they probably read it from start to finish.
Even if they immediately digested it, it would suggest that the mid-90s is the earliest possible terminus date for the earliest possible Gospels. So that would really already start suggesting to me that the entire Gospel tradition is a second century one.
Yeah.
Just right there. I mean, in addition to Papias and the anti-Marcionite prologue, which I'm gaining new confidence in, but I think there are a bunch of good reasons. It's quite clear, as many others have pointed out, that the Gospels are clearly working in a post-war context, and you can feel that and see it. Roman money is being used, for example. Jesus isn't stoned by the Sanhedrin as James was. It's almost as though they're assuming a post-war political context and economic context where Roman money is used, and that's almost unheard of before the First War.
And I think you also need at least an environment of writing and writers, and we don't know of any Jewish or Christian such environment in the first century. I mean, we have the exception of a Josephus. But here he's got all the means from the Roman government. I mean, without this kind of infrastructure which is being provided to him, he wouldn't have had the money and the means, let alone the time. We don't know of any such environment neither for Jews nor for early Christians. That apparently is what Clement and others tell us is one of the results of the Second Jewish War. When we have an influx, I mean, we have a move of people, we have a gathering of people in Rome. Clement gives us a whole list of people who moved to Rome or to Alexandria and started their didaskalia there. And here we've got an infrastructure which is no longer directly dependent on the Roman state. But I think, James, you're absolutely right with your proximity to Rome. It's no longer just like in Josephus's case that the emperor provides the scriptorium for Josephus, but it's an environment which is governed by Roman academic laws more than Jewish, I think. Which is governed by the finances, be it the fees the students pay. Justin complains about those kind of structures, but still makes use of them. Even if he doesn't charge for the courses, but it's in an environment where those charges are being applied and being used to, and where he knows about all of that. Competition, Galen talks about. I mean, this is a mid-second century environment where we have this culture of which we are talking, and we don't have that in the first century, certainly not after the First Jewish War.
Another fascinating implication is that there are a couple of places, especially in Revelation, it seems to me, where there's a suggestion that there is something in the way of building the temple.
The Antichrist temple?
It's no longer the desert that Josephus sort of describes it as, the laid waste, not one stone upon another. There seems now to be something in the way, and that didn't happen until Hadrian started constructing his temple at the site of the old Jewish temple. Does that also suggest to you that perhaps the Johannine literature has to be post Bar Kokhba?
I'd like to add to that real fast before he answers. Dr. Bartosz Adamczewski, who I recently interviewed, suggested that Matthew's account of the fall of the temple says that something was built in its place where an abomination of desolation shouldn't be standing. And he thinks that's referring to the Aelia Capitolina that was built by Emperor Hadrian in 132 AD. What are your thoughts on that?
Stated that in a few of my publications because I think that's exactly what I took from it. There you've got the cut has taken in the text, and I think that refers to something that's standing there. And as we know, after 70, nothing was standing; it was all erased. Yeah, and after 132, you have something standing there. You have the obstacle. A visible obstacle, and which is then being even elaborated on and fortified into what becomes known for years and decades as the Aelia Capitolina.
And that would suggest that at least some of our New Testament literature is after the Second Revolt. So
definitely,
we're developing here multiple reasons for believing that the Gospels are a second century project, not a first century one.
Yeah. You know, an idol, the concept of an idol being set up in the temple to desecrate it fits only in the 40s of the first century, or
exactly
under Hadrian.
Exactly.
It doesn't fit 70, not at all.
I think that's correct. Caligula was going to do some testing
of course,
and that stimulated. But fortunately, Caligula's death allowed them to step back from that politically dangerous move. But where it really makes sense is at the time of Hadrian. I think that makes full sense because it really happened, right? And therefore would be traumatic to or at least noticed to the local population. Now that makes much more sense in the second century, Second Revolt period than even in Caligula's time, it seems to me.
Well, New Testament scholars have always needed to refer to Caracalla and to this plan. But none of our ancient writers referred to this plan, which is being apparently not executed. And whereas what's being executed, that's what we have in the 140s. So I think some even conservative New Testament scholars have said, well, if we want to take these indications as historical implications, then we would need to put it into the second century. That was only said, of course, to disregard it as a historical fact and to go for the 70s as the
idea that it would be an immediate reaction against the threat of the erection of the idol by Caligula, right? It's possible, but I think it's statistically, right, it's on the improbable side that we would just happen to have a literary remain from the weeks or months in the interim period before that it fizzled out. And then of course there would be the problem of course there are always answers to these objections, but still there is the objection that, well, why it would be rather embarrassing, and that's an argument that's been used for its authenticity. But for me, it just seems statistically improbable that it would be referring to the threat that was made by Caligula and that never materialized, because I really do think it would have been thrown back on the archives as, it's just, hey, that's false prophecy, right? That's how people thought then. So
Jacobs interviewed a couple of, and I think it's good that he does this, but Jacobs interviewed a couple of people who insist that gospel material in its full final form as we have it was basically completed before the first war.
Yesterday I interviewed Dr. Jonathan Bernier, and he's published a book that's basically 180 degrees opposite of this discussion. He's got Mark already being completely written in its final form in the 40s AD, with a little bit of sprinkles of Pauline epistles in the late 40s, and putting the rest of them in the 50s, with Matthew and Luke both being written in the 50s from his point of view, and John being
what's the argument?
60 to 70. So his argument, as he laid it out to me in the interview yesterday and in the book. He says, well, all we have is prophecies. He says that just from the prophecies themselves, we don't have any indication the temple was destroyed. So he says the Gospels don't know the temple was destroyed. That's his argument. I know one of the things that scholars will.
So Mark 13's beautifully accurate description of what happens in the year 70, I mean, down to detail, and including a mystic vision of armies fighting in the clouds that seems to be reproduced in Josephus, just a miraculous prophecy. That with the Ben-Ananus prophecy, all he's really saying, according to Josephus, and much closer to the war, by the way, is woe to Jerusalem, and then finally, woe to me. There aren't these details, although there are, parallels that are very interesting to it, and that may have been the inspiration for Mark 13, in effect. We don't have is Mark 13, though, which seems to be a reflection of the reality. And so my general rule that these miraculously accurate prophecies are generally written after the event as some kind of to establish some theological point about the event. That's how we treat ancient Hebrew prophecy.
Yeah, the way Jonathan looks at it is when he looks at the common scholarly viewpoint on Mark 13 is he'll say, well, the Jews thought the second temple would be destroyed because the first temple was destroyed, so their familiarity with the temple having been destroyed before is one of his arguments. And the other argument is he actually uses Jesus Ben-Ananus to prove his own point that, well, there were already Jews before AD 70 saying the temple would be destroyed. So he combines all of that to argue his
nothing
position
about the fine detail of the Jesus apocalypse in Mark 13 that seems to correspond with the reality that Josephus reports. I mean, it corresponds so perfectly to the reality that Josephus reports, including this seeming fulfillment of the Son of Man prophecy of Daniel. I mean, it is a remarkable combination of things in Mark 13, which seems to be a reflection, and here's another reflection of Josephian description, right? I find that
I think the major problem with all these arguments, and he's not the only one. I mean, there's a long tradition of New Testament scholarship to date these texts even prior to 70. And the more conservative you get, the more these texts are dated earlier. The problem with all these arguments is that the arguments are internal arguments, are textually internal arguments. So you start from the premise that Mark, Matthew, John, and Luke are first century documents. The other problem, of course, that nobody refers to these documents except these writers who write Gospels. Nobody else. Not Josephus, none that we know. Even no Christian author. I mean, not a single Christian author before 140 ever refers to one of these documents. Now, because you've got that problem, right, then you have to either predate authors who then quote these early Christian writings like Ignatius or Papias, and you have to make a claim that these documents support each other. So when you open up an introduction to New Testament studies, you will see that people usually say, oh, Mark, we are not sure, probably before 70, maybe 40, so we don't know exactly. Then we come to Matthew, and on Matthew, you are already getting the information that because Matthew relies and uses Mark, he must be after, let's say, after 40, or probably after 70. Then you go to Luke when they say, oh, it's certainly after Mark and Matthew. So we're already in the 80s. And the more you have that kind of snowball principle of certainty, so you move from an uncertain powdery snow Yeah, once you come to the third gospel, you've got a big ball, yeah, which you then throw to the camp of John, and then you've got the fixed dating of the first century. And that's how the entire New Testament scholarship works.
Well, that just sounds
Once-
shocking. That sounds utterly illogical, not evidence-based.
Yeah, once you buy into that, you can date anything into the first century.
I mean, frankly, it's hard to even imagine Mark 13 could have possibly been written before 70. I mean, frankly, it sounds almost absurd to me.
Well, you have to, excuse me, Jacob.
Yes, it's fine.
Go ahead.
Well, I just get this theory that I've not heard anybody else put forth, that the Gospels were written in something like 40 BCE, and that they were all prophecy, that it was all prediction. None of it had happened.
I tell you,
but don't worry, it did later.
Robert,
Actually, that's a good point.
I've written a big book about the history of the Apostles' Creed, yeah, and in those 1600 years, from the first time it appears in about 404 in Rufinus's commentary until 2004, that's the cover of the time span that I'm covering with this book from 2006, right? I also mentioned those scholars in the past who have claimed that the Apostles' Creed was issued by Moses, because it's all embedded already in hundreds of years BC. Don't get me wrong, my experience with New and Old Testament scholarship is...
Those are actually all good points, because it highlights the fact that we're with a lot. Now, I'm not going to make any accusations about any one particular scholar, but it does highlight the point, right, that many, I'm not going to say most, I'm going to try to be nice, but many New Testament scholars are really practicing apologetics. They're not being open about it, right? Because they have a personal need for there to be an historical chain of transmission, of apostolic succession.
Does it seem to you guys? Does it seem to you guys that the reason
from the earliest times of patristics, and so it doesn't matter if to one of us this seems impossible or unlikely, but it is a worldview that is formed, right? And it makes sense from that particular worldview. And I guess you could compare it to to a literalist historical understanding of the rabbinic chains of transmission, in contrast to, let's say, a model by Rabbi Jacob Neusner, right, who sees these transmissions more as symbols, right, to get important points of halakha or ethics or morality across, which then, for me, and here I cannot speak someone inside, the Christian mindset, but looking at it from the outside, it looks to me like there's a problem with theology going on there. And I think that Bultmann actually had a pretty good idea for Christians, and that is that this idea of the Christ of faith should not be disturbed, right, by anything you can read about the historical Jesus. But I'm not a Christian theologian, but that seems to be a good place to start.
Right. Do you guys think that the reason that some scholars are attempting to push the text even earlier, closer to Jesus' time, is because they're trying to make Jesus the founder of Christianity and make the text more historical?
Sure.
I think Dr. Zinner makes a really great point there, especially at the end. Even if you are a secular thinker, you might be committed just to the ethics of Jesus. And you may think it is a form of ethical idealism that you're committed to. And even if you reject this, take the President of the United States of some fame, a guy named Thomas Jefferson, did his own Greek translation of the New Testament, cut out the miracles, but left in the moral teachings, and wrote, I think Jesus is one of the greatest moral philosophers who ever lived. Now, even that kind of a commitment to the moral teachings of Christianity, I think, will tend to get scholars to want to give it authenticity, as Dr. Zinner just pointed out, to get it back authentically to this moral idea. And I think that's problematic. I think there are theological, and as everyone knows, I think there are political agendas that are noticeable in the texts, and that does not makes sense to me that we can trade. I mean, and if anything that critical scholarship has shown, it's shown that most, if not the vast majority of the purported sayings of Jesus in the Gospels simply are unlikely to be authentic sayings of a historical Jesus that go back to 30 AD. But I think there's a sort of a commitment, an ethical commitment, that predisposes even some secular scholars to want it to really go back to Jesus, the real deal, you know?
I'm going to take a look at
it. I think it was a big tendency in the 19th century as an anti-enlightenment movement, which both in the Protestant churches, just like a bit later than in the Catholic churches, pushed for this kind of romantic idea, and the romantic idea needed the link between the origin and what came afterwards. And even the entire tradition, which then translates in the 20th century into what we call now reception history, is still playing on that ball of originality, which is then being transmitted just like holy scripts are being transmitted, or the big players are being transmitted like Aristotle, Plato. But we're only dealing with let's say, valuable treasures which the romantics want to preserve, and you only have that preservation if you have a genealogical study which gives you the proof stamp, like when you look at paintings in modern art galleries. You need to have the proof, that you can trace back step by step without any interruption to the original owner and to the painter, her or himself.
Let's take a look at this next super chat here, because I need to catch up on those. Moss Windenberg, thank you for another super chat. What is the meaning of the Pauline according to the scriptures if he does not have those scriptures in Hebrew?
That's a Dr. Price question, if I've ever read one.
Well, it reminds me of Dewey Beagle in his book, The Inspiration of Scripture, where he says, what does it mean to say the original autographs were inspired and inerrant when we don't have them and cannot verify them? And what originals are you talking about? Do you think that the book of Isaiah, the Epistle to the Romans, etc., were all written in a single setting by a single author, like as if Stephen King or Dickens or somebody were writing? Because it does, given the tradition, history, and all that, it just is inapplicable. It doesn't make any sense to put it that way anymore. What originals? And I think that's right. But something really disturbing about the idea of, it's got to be Jesus. We got to show that it was Jesus. I don't understand. Like, if there is wisdom that cuts you to the quick, as in the book of Acts, when you read these things, does it matter if Jesus said it or Peter or was the result of a bunch of monkeys clattering away on typewriters randomly? What difference does it make? And that's why Proverbs are generally anonymous. You don't need to know who coined them, because that's not where their truth lies. It's going to ring true to you, the kind of thing that makes you say, wow, I never thought of that, but of course it's true. I mean, that's why any of it, like J.B. Phillips said, the ring of truth. And if you say no, it's got to be by Mr. Authority, you're just talking about divine command ethics, right? I don't care what it says. If it says you shall kill your neighbor, not love him, if you can tell me Jesus said it, I'll start sharpening the knife. Of course, nobody thinks that way, except certain fanatics. But that's the reductio ad absurdum to that kind of a thing. Is it just that Jesus said it? Surely not. It's just mixed up apologetics.
Let's take a look at the next one here.
Yes.
Let me just go back to that question, because because when Paul says according to the scriptures, I mean, most scholars today would say, he's referring to a kind of Greek sort of collection of Jewish writings. not necessarily as we know to the Septuagint, because we have too many differences between the quotes that he gives and the Septuagint as we have it, when in the form we have it, which is also not easy. But then we also need to ask what is meant here when Amos here asks for the Pauline according to the scriptures. In Ephesians, for example, we have a clear reference which goes back and says what I've said before, and it's taken as a saying of the Curious of the Lord. And this is clearly a quote from another Pauline text where it is stated as a Pauline saying. So apparently, when we come to what we call today pseudo-Paulines take already writings of Pauline nature as scripture, which is quite a strange phenomenon. And which is quite similar to what we get in Irenaeus, for example, that there is not a clear image and picture and concept of what scriptures are. And I doubt that we have a clear concept of according to the scriptures in the first 200 years of our time. So that's quite a mixture. But we have to look at every author, because there are authors who have a better idea of what the scriptures are. Others have a less explicit form of the concept of scripture.
Let's take a look at the next one now. Amos Wittenberg, thanks again for another super chat. Is the redaction of the Mishnah a pushback against the hegemony of Roman law in the post-Bar Kokhba imperial environment?
Well, who wants to attack this one? Marcus?
Well, I'm not attacking it, because I would think that it's clearly a pushback, not just against the hegemony of Roman law, but also of all kinds of laws which are not in this kind of what we later call the rabbinic tradition. I'm not even sure whether this is pushback or whether we shouldn't talk about a re-encircling of themselves into a kind of their own make of a law. And we shouldn't forget that the bulk of these laws are not produced in Egypt. They're not produced in Jerusalem. The bulk of these laws are being developed in the Persian environment. So that's not within a Roman, strictly speaking, a Roman environment.
Yeah.
That's right. By its pack. That's probably just my bad English. That means I meant to take on a question. Yes, but that's a good point, right? Especially if there are two, as we know, there are two Talmuds, right? The Bavli, right, associated with Babylonia, the Persian context he mentioned, and then of course the so-called Jerusalem or Palestinian Talmud, right? Yeah. And so then we have the Mishnah and the Gemara, but you probably don't want to lecture on all of that. But that's, I think, very much the case that we're not talking so much about some of these directly, right, in the train or in the wake, right, of the effects of the quashing of the Bar Kokhba revolt. It's much more expansive and complex than that.
Yeah, it's a complex negotiation of maintaining Jewish identity and in some way maintaining Mosaic law in an increasingly hostile environment. That is true. But I think that's as generalized as all can be.
Well, it's its own field.
Yeah, what a surprise how little the Roman law plays a role in the Mishnah.
Exactly.
Let's take a look at the next one. Paul Kickling, thank you for the super chat. I think it's important to keep in mind that Christianity existed before the composition of the Gospels. Why can't the original scriptures of the apostles were updated suiting the political milieu?
Well, you know, Jacob, I think that under the influence of Professor Vinzent, we're actually zeroing in on a pretty good rule of thumb about hypothetical ancient texts. I would be skeptical of an ancient text that we hypothesize the existence of, that we either do not have some bit of the text itself from, or an ancient author credibly telling us that the text existed. So take, for example, even the logic behind Q. Unless we actually we don't have Q, obviously, But unless we have an ancient author, say like Papias, saying that there could be something, a logoi of Aristion or an earlier Hebrew Matthew, I would tend to say that the ancient text, the hypothetical text that we're imagining, really we have insufficient reason for believing it existed. But if we can think of the logo, Papias's logoi of Aristion as somehow being Q, or somehow the Qumran stuff from Q is in the Hebrew version of Matthew, then at least we have texts that will support that. But otherwise, I wouldn't think of. I tend to be highly skeptical of anything, an Luke, Matthew, Mark, unless we have the text, unless we have an ancient author.
Some scholars will postulate endless proto-marks.
Well, see,
exactly. I mean, this is like Eric Beaumont and others, right, where you get lost in the designs of those stemma. But may I take Paul Kickling's question a bit differently? When he says it's important to keep in mind that Christianity existed before the composition of the Gospels, I would say, yes, I would agree that it's important to keep in mind that people who had some ideas or some ways of remembering what happened, like the earliest forms in Pauline thinking, but I wouldn't call that Christianity. I think that is anachronistic. None of the people, neither Paul nor Jesus himself, nor any of the people around him, if they ever existed, would have called themselves Christians.
Right.
I think that's from all we know, at least, from all we know, it is a kind of a name that's being stuck on their foreheads against their will. So I think to the end of the first century, and probably, if I'm not mistaken, to the middle of the second century, people would have rejected the idea that they are being called Christians. So if people existed before the composition of the Gospels, I think then the Gospels themselves are rather a final step of, as he has been saying here, Paul, as updating and making the message suitable to the new social and political milieus and needs. And one of that need was to come up with a new identity. And this new identity, as we have them in the first apologists, and the first Christian apologists do not exist, none of them, from the first century. The first known apologists that we know who make a claim for a new form of religion is after Bar Kokhba. It's in the 140s. It's not one single apologist who claims or makes a claim that Christians are different.
It's clear that
from Egyptian before.
It's clear that, we're talking about a second century context, especially a first half of the second century context. There are a variety of approaches to Christianity that are emerging. And what we call Christianity is not, when we say Christianity existed before the gospel, what sense do we mean Christianity existed before the Gospels? In a far more nebulous sense, and one that people could take in different directions. We know Marcion's going off on his, more Hellenized direction. The Gnostics are going to go off on their more Hellenized direction. So what we have is a variety of Christianities, and the canonical folks are trying to come to be seen as the canonical folks have to be seen as sort of ironing out the differences between, say, the school of Peter and the school of Paul, and you see that explicitly in Acts, right? That attempt to integrate.
James, if when you talk about Christianities, I would even that put into question marks or in quotation marks, because we have not one single reference to the abstract term Christianity in the first century, not one single.
Right. That's one. And if you're of my persuasion, right? The purported first use, right? Usually, sometimes Josephus will be invoked here for these terms like Judaism, right? But as far as Christianity is concerned, right, we find this in the early second century, purportedly in Ignatius. But in my opinion, these are all fakes, forgeries. There are no 7 authentic epistles of Ignatius, at least in my opinion. So his mentioning of Christianity in contrast to, right, and some even contradiction to Judaism, it has to be dated decades later, several decades later.
I have always been, and I'm growing still more, utterly skeptical of Ignatius and what's ascribed to him, frankly. On the other hand, I think and frankly, gentlemen, the second century church fathers have always been a slippery matter for me, you know, but I am coming more and more to realize that maybe we should take the Papias fragments and the anti-Marcionite prologues more seriously. Maybe we should take Tertullian's references to Marcion more seriously. And I know I'm coming under the influence of Professor Vinzent here.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
but I am causing a revolution in my own thought, Professor Vinzent, for which I want to thank you.
I mean, just to come back to Ignatius, to which I've dedicated a large chapter in this book, How to Write Early Christian History, where I show that Cureton's published Syriac edition of the 3 letters predate those 7 letters, and what Cureton has long tried to show, and which I think is undeniable. And it's interesting that in those 3 letters, you will not find the abstract term of Christianity. You only find them in those 4 letters, which have been added to the 3 letters. And only in those 4 letters, particularly in the letters to the Magnesians, there you will find the debate about a new standing of Christianity against Judaism. None of that is in the 3 letters. And like a number of other developments, I mean, you will find hundreds of references to Jesus Christ in the 4 letters, which have been added to the 3 letters, and in the reworked forms of the 3 letters. And you will not find many of those or most of those in the 3 letters. And that was the initial feeling which I had, where I questioned Lightfoot's claim that these 3 letters were just an abbreviation of the 4th century by an ascetic monk. I mean, who, as a historian, can believe that an ascetic monk cuts out all the references to Jesus Christ?
I have a hard time believing.
It's just implausible, right?
Zinner, you in the testimonium in the Antiquities, Jesus that we have, the version we have it, Jesus tells us about a tribe, as it's generally translated, called Christians. You think that part is authentic as well? He's talking about a group of people called Christians in the Antiquities.
He doesn't call them Christians, though. It's a tribe, right? And this, you see, is to be compared to an earlier passage in the Antiquities where Josephus actually uses the same lexical constellation, where he refers to the Judeans, right, who departed back to the homeland after their exile. And to this day, they have been called, this tribe has been called after the name of basically their ancestor, right? And so this is the same.
It is Josephine, that's for sure.
But there is a difference, right? So in that earlier passage, he has a label for these people. They're Judeans, right, or Jews. But in the testimonium, he doesn't have an analog to that. He just refers to the tribe of the people who follow this particular, who are named after who are named after this man, right? So they're followers of Christ. This is much different from the concept of Christianity versus Judaism.
Let's take a look at this next.
Find in Aelius Aristides, what you just mentioned. It's descendant from somebody, but it hasn't got its own identity yet.
I think these
it's not a theological. In other words, it's not really a theological label, right?
Or even a sociological one. I mean, there's no group name to it, right? Forget about theology. I mean, it's first of all, there's no group name for it. Right? So you walk into a city and you can't ask where's the Christian church, or where's the Jewish church? No, you walk in a city and you say, well, do you know something about this group or the people? Not even a group, the people who have some Jewish practice and speak Greek. Like in Europe was a very good example, right? You walk to the city. If you are Persian-speaking Jew, you walk into the synagogue, what we call synagogue today. Yeah. If you're Greek speaking, you probably also walk into the same building. But if you're only Greek speaking, and let's say you're a bit more conservatively Greek, you walk into the building which today we call a baptistry.
Yes.
Because all the inscriptions we have in this so-called Christian building are Greek inscriptions. In the so-called Jewish synagogue, we have multiple inscriptions. We have 6 or 7 dialects of Persian. We have Latin, we have Greek, we have even a Hebrew fragment. So I think we have to think in sociological terms about these kind of group formations. Yeah. And they are very loose in the 1st century, and I think they're still loose in the 2nd century. And forgive me, but I think we are too romantic in our reprojections of the denominations that we have today and the kinds of religious practice which we assume took place in the 1st and 2nd century.
Excellent points you're making.
Let's take a look at this next super chat here.
Sorry.
Paul. Oh, it's fine. Paul Kickling, thanks for another super chat. He says, in fact, the school of thought of Christianity can be traced far back as 700 BCE, where Judaism and Zoroastrianism influenced the monist sects of paganism. It is a refinement of the same philosophy and knowledge.
Well,
I would turn that upside. Sorry, I would turn that upside down. I mean, I do totally agree that the school of thought, what later becomes known as Christianity, yeah, can be traced back pretty early. But I would not think that we can differentiate who was it. Judaism. I mean, Boyarin would question that, and I would question it too. But whatever, the traditions that we know, these kind of monotheistic traditions, which were paramount in the Persian environment, yeah, that those influenced each other. I strongly think that Zoroastrian traditions have become influential for Jewish thinking and praxis, because when we look into the Torah, almost none of the things which feature in post-exilic Jewish traditions are present. So we have neither the paradise nor the Satan. We have resurrection is absent in the Torah, 5 books Moses. All of that, the judgment, final judgment, and God knows what. This type of apocalypticism.
Yeah.
All that is the baggage which Jews are packing on themselves from their environment in the Babylonian and Zoroastrian influence sphere, and which becomes part of and parcel of Christian tradition, which I think if the Jews had not been in the Persian environment for so many centuries, Christianity wouldn't be what it is today.
Said it better than I could, Professor.
There's a lot to unpack in a question like that.
Yeah.
All right. Jack Bull, thanks for the super chat. He says,
Jack is listening to me. Yeah.
There may not be 7, but there could be 3 epistles.
Yeah, we have a debate about whether if Curaton's right about the 3 epistles of that refers to Ignatius, because Jack is writing his PhD on those 3 epistles, trying to take the critical reading even further, which I think he is easily able to do. And I do think that those 3 epistles, whether ever they are authentic, we will see.
Well, I have to say, Jack.
I mean, we have to look for.
Jack has really influenced me further on my skepticism of Ignatius. He's only pushed poor Ignatius off the cliff in my mind. So I want to chat, but for your helping me move in that direction.
No, I would say the most powerful evidence for the priority of the 3 Syriac documents is actually the stylometric evidence, right? And that's much more powerful than the question, can we conceive of a monk deleting references to Jesus? Because perhaps so, right? Maybe it's improbable, but one can always think of some kind of comeback. But when you look at the stylometric evidence, this is very powerful in my opinion. Now, it doesn't answer the question of, all right, are these 3 Syriac documents actually historical, written by Ignatius, or there are interpolations in those? And I recall Jack would actually affirm that there are some interpolations even in those 3 Syriac documents, but the stylometric evidence, that's for me almost open and shut. That's powerful, powerful evidence.
You know, John Calvin rejected the authenticity of all 14 Ignatian epistles, like the one to the Virgin Mary and all of this stuff. Of course, he kind of figured they stand or fall all together, which is naive, but it is kind of interesting. You see them fall like sheaves of grain in the harvest one by one.
We'll take a look at the next one. Johnny Bologna, I hope I pronounced your last name right. He says, "Hi, James. Where are we on the documentary film? Love your Flavian theory. All best from a film producer."
Oh, well, thank you, Mr. Bologna. COVID unfortunately delayed production. Everything in Hollywood shut down for a year. And the original schedule of 2-year production time was delayed. And so they're having to spend the rest of this year finishing it up. We're hoping that the documentary, which is grown now to a multi-part documentary, backing up, generally looking at Roman providence, will be out early next year. But they're finishing it up. They're doing the important post-production work on it right now. And I'm told that hopefully by the start of 2023, we'll have the release of a multi-part documentary on Roman providence. I'm very excited.
Congratulations. Yeah.
Thank you very much. The sales on Creating Christ, believe it or not, are going faster now than the first year of their release. So there's a growing interest out there in the general idea of Roman providence. The influence of Greco-Roman culture on Christianity, I think, is finally getting the attention that it has long deserved. So thank you for your question, though.
So you figure the documentary will supersede classics like Demetrius and the Gladiators?
Well, not from me. I'm sorry. I love those old.
Me too.
I'm never going to talk about Ben-Hur and Charlton Heston is in the 10 Commandments. They're
I've just been to Morocco, and I was in Morocco 20 years ago when Gladiator was filmed, and I met the director, but he was a bit annoyed that day because the giraffe had run off, so there were big concerns with other problems.
Right, the whole giraffe, the queer giraffe. Gladiator.
Yeah, they were running after the giraffe in the desert. Yeah.
I regard him as my favorite. I think he's the greatest film director today. If you have the privilege of meeting him, okay, I'm jealous. Sorry, I had to do that.
That was a great day.
We got another super chat. Paul Kickling again. Thanks for another super chat. He says Christianity existed as Merkava mysticism in Judaism, Platonism, Orphism in Greece, Krishnaism in Hinduism, Zoroastrian Messianism in Persia. Revelations is even said to be pre-Christian. Updated document.
Well, it is pointed out Justin Martyr, the 2nd century Christian apologist, pointed out that there's all kinds of precursors, and he presented the idea that somehow all those predecessors were, quote, Christianity. Of course, it's problematic to call those precursors Christianity, which is a very specific term. As we've been discussing, it probably didn't really emerge until well into the 2nd century. But yeah, are there all kinds of religious precursors that may have influenced Christianity? Certainly were a part of the cultural milieu of the area when Christianity emerged. Absolutely. But I don't think we can flat out call Krishnaism Christianity. There are important differences, whatever the obvious sort of parallels and connections, which may have had an influence on them. I think they're two separate questions, and we have to treat it that way.
Yeah, I think I've got the problem just with the T's and the isms, right? If we take out all the T's and the isms, And if we are then aware that, as I mentioned to one of my students this week, the question is, how high do I fly over the ground? Yeah. So if I'm crawling over the ground, I don't see any kind of similarities. If I take an aeroplane, right, 10,000 meters over ground, I think, oh, they all look alike. There must be one architect who has built all houses. Yeah. So the question is, which kind of zooming in do I take and which kind of perspective I take? So I think as scholars, we're not crowding and we're not flying. So we walk our way and try to best make sense of the differences and similarities we can see.
Right.
But it's not easy.
Right.
This is like in the academic study of Kabbalah, we don't talk about Kabbalah. We talk about a specific Kabbalist or a specific text. Right? Because there's no Kabbalah except in Hollywood, perhaps. Right?
Yeah, like Merkava. I mean, Merkava. If you take the very specialists of Merkava, we have texts which we associate with a certain kind of heavenly imagery, of kavod and of other imageries, which we associate with a certain tendency and tradition. But as we know, there were centers of people who developed these types of thinking and of imageries and then copied those things. But whether there were ever schools before the late medieval period, we're not sure about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, elements reoccur, of course, yeah. And if we take the Apocalypse, probably the least of the what we typically would call an apocalypse is the one which has been incorporated into the New Testament at the end. I mean, many other documents, which to me and to my mind are more apocalyptic than John's apocalypses, were later excluded. I mean, the Apocalypse of Peter somehow made it in the New Testament, was later excluded for various reasons. John was heavily discussed and debated in early Christianity whether it should ever be a part of the so-called writings that are accepted.
Right.
So it's a difficult process.
Yeah. I have to believe that in its origins, Apocalypse is sort of the rebel genre.
Yeah, it is.
That makes sense. And when we see Christian versions of it, we should expect to find the beast of Rome in Rome, for example. These seem to be imagematic reflections, and with the discovery of the Qumran sectarian doctrines, I think this is quite clear. And surely the reference, Josephus sort of whitewashes this out of John the Baptist, but surely the quotations we get from the Baptist in the Gospels unmistakably mark him as an apocalyptic preacher, and I suspect Jesus was as well. If there was a historical Jesus, he was surely an apocalyptic preacher of the lines of, say, the Baptist or our Qumran sectarians.
Of course, we have periods of times when apocalyptics flourish better and more than in other times. Yeah, times of crisis, times of wars. You will have these people featuring and being received, multiplied, and so forth.
Yes, there was another flourishing of apocalyptic literature, as you know, during the rise of Islam. So it gives us many important Jewish apocalypses, like the one attributed to Zerubbabel, for instance, but a wide variety of Jewish and Christian apocalypses at that time.
Right.
Just as fascinating as the ancient ones, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And just as important for different reasons.
Yeah.
This brings to mind a passage I read recently in a Nag Hammadi document, the Apocryphon of James, that a few scholars identify a small paragraph in there as an allusion to the Pella flight tradition. I'm not sure if that's what it's alluding to, but it's clearly it's an astounding passage, right? Because in the early Christian literature, the flight from Pella, right? So it's the flight of so-called Jewish Christians all right, from Jerusalem during the First Jewish War is always spoken of positively, is condoned, and it is even said there was an oracle of the Lord. I don't know if that means Jesus or God for those authors, but right, telling them to flee, like in the the Synoptic Apocalypse, right? When you see this and that, then flee to the mountains. But this passage in the Apocrypha of James condemns those who flee as cowards, and that they should stay and defend the city. Right, and so I'm tempted. I'm not going to go into a discourse. I'm tempted to see a reference to the Kaitos War there, but it's possible we could have something referring to Bar Kokhba. But in any case, what is astounding is that this is the only passage I'm aware of personally that in Christian, quote unquote, Christian literature, which again, that's a problematic term for even that document, I believe, that speaks of this fleeing Jerusalem in negative terms. It's condemned as an act of cowardice, where you should stay. You should stay and defend it. Anyway, I thought I'd throw that out there. It's a very difficult passage, comparatively speaking.
One.
Yes,
interesting one.
It's interesting too because the claim at the beginning is that James has written this secret book in the Hebrew letters, right, which immediately will call to mind the Papiast tradition, right, about Matthew writing the Gospel in the Hebrew language. Though actually, the Apocrypha of James has a very specific description. It's in the Hebrew letters, right, rather than in the Hebrew phonics or language. It's not totally unattested, but it's still a bit unusual. But in any case, here's another example of something in here that makes it problematic for me to have labels such as Christian for this type of document. Very famously, this document has Jesus in heaven for 550 days, after which he descends to earth to teach for 18 days. Now, there are differences of opinion on how to interpret these numbers, or if we should amend the text, et cetera, et cetera. But if we take it as the text stands to see if it will be lucid, if we assume that the author is thinking Jesus is crucified on 14 Nisan, 550 days then takes us to Tishri the 3rd, which is the day after the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. And then 18 days of teaching the parables of the kingdom takes us to 21 Tishri, the conclusion of Sukkot. All right, so even though this document was probably originally written in Greek and then translated into the Coptic manuscript we have, and not composed in Hebrew, as the fictive narrative has it, this is, I think, a tremendous piece of evidence for knowledge of the Jewish liturgical calendar, right? And just to call this a Christian document,
rebel document to me.
Well, who knows, right? The Apocrypha of James, right, has some monographs have been published on it, of course, but it's still relatively uncommented upon compared to many of the other Nag Hammadi texts, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip. They get all the publicity, right? So it's difficult to know. I personally, I'm certainly leaning towards this Kaitos possibility, right? But it's I don't know.
As I say, it seems to be, if it's condemning those who fled to Pella, then it seems to be saying Jewish Messianics stay in the fight. And if it's referring to a sectarian Jewish calendar, and it's preserving that through all this, it's beginning to sound more and more to me not like what we call a Pauline Christian document at all, but it's not. Document.
Denkard Kishner is the one who wrote the exegetical commentary in the Nag Hammadi, in the German edition of the Nag Hammadi library. He wrote the commentary, and I would quote Hornschuh who wrote an important monograph on the Epistle of the Apostles back in 65, I think it was. But he uses the term chemisch rein, right? So it's chemically pure. There is no Pauline theology in this Apocryphon of James. It's this chemically pure of it, because the rehabilitation of Paul would come many, many, many decades later, right? Many decades later. But curiously, at the end of that document, what happens? There's an ascension scene. Now, some scholars have rightly picked up on the allusion to this, where Jesus says, I'm going to ascend because on a chariot of the Spirit, right? Now this, and usually Plato's Phaedrus is referenced, but there's nothing about a chariot of the Spirit, right, in the allegory of the chariot, right, in Plato. But this is an exact word for word echo from 1 Enoch 70, Enoch's ascension, right?
Right.
And so there is this, and the reason I'm bringing all of this up is to show how Judaic sources could still be alive in this Jesus movement, right, in these early period of the 2nd century. It makes even more problematic this whole throwing out labels. This is Christian, this is Jewish. Jewish Christian. I use that as a term for reference, but of course, scholars today try to avoid that term even because it's so problematic.
Let's take a look at this
I
next
completely agree. Yeah.
Paul Kickling again, thanks for another super chat. Where scholars go wrong is thinking Christianity was supposed to replace existing schools of philosophy and religions. It's supposed to be of a supplementary nature. At least that was the apostles' intentions.
Well, the apostles' intentions, I think, are difficult to read. I mean, at least for me. But I would agree with the principle of this statement, right? That from what we read and what we've just heard from Samuel is the complementarity of the various schools of philosophy and religions. I'm not sure. I mean, they probably were as competitive as we as scholars are today around the world. I mean, we are nice to each other. We all want to learn from each other. We want all to be clever, at least as clever as the others are. So that's part of the game. But it doesn't mean that we want to be on top of others. Yeah. We want to be in an engagement with each other to advance scholarship. And I think that's very, very true for the first centuries as well. There's a competition for audience like it is today, but that's it. I think it's not replacement.
Not replacement, but it's impossible. Cynic elements, as many scholars have pointed out, in our New Testament documents. And that's just the philosophical milieu of the period. This was a period of rising Neoplatonism. This was a period, obviously, of intense interest in Stoicism by the Romans. So it's hardly surprising that the leading pagan schools of philosophy, for example, should find echoes in general. What's surprising to me is that a form of militant messianic Judaism that had resulted in all of this military and political conflict should itself sort of be Hellenized, because these are our Jewish rebels are the least likely to be. They're the ones resisting Hellenistic influence the most, and yet very frequently what we'll see in our Greek literature that turns up in the New Testament, we'll see the most Hellenized Greco-Roman influence of Stoic or Platonic, Neoplatonic or Cynic philosophy. But that's the cultural atmosphere of the world. The Greek-speaking world of the Eastern Mediterranean and Roman times, the forms of their religion are going to influence Christianity, and certainly the dominant philosophical schools are going to influence Christianity. I think that's the way we have to look at it.
Dr. Vincent, recently I had seen an article that you wrote on the Ascension of Isaiah, and I think you were comparing it to Marcion and Marcionite theology. What do you see that they have in common between the two?
First of all, I think I do explore some of these writings in relation to Marcion because they've never been put in relation to Marcion. So that's the only reason, not because I've got a tunnel view and see everything from a Marcionite perspective, right, which people sometimes claim. No, but in the Ascension of Isaiah, the interesting part of it is the concentration on propheticism. It's the big prophet of Isaiah. So it's not the Torah. So here comes a prophetic writing, which at the same time is, and that something for James, is an apocalyptic writing within a war scenario. And I do think that not only because we have these Christian elements in the Ascension Isaiah, where it is still unclear whether the writing was originally just a Jewish writing without these elements, or whether with some minority scholarship, it is from the start a Christian writing. I think we can't resolve the problem of
some of those are
there was ever an origin to the text, yeah.
But
it's clear there are Marcionite and anti-Marcionite elements, as so often in early Christian texts. The Marcionite idea is we're dealing with a phenomenal divine figure of Christ, who has been birthed in a small city in Bethlehem, even more dramatic and more historically and physically visible and discussed than we have it in the Gospels. So that I would see as an anti-Marcionite feature, that it is not enough what Matthew tells us about the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. It's not enough what Luke is giving us. You have to have even more details, and you have to have more witnesses. Yeah, you have the ladies talking about this birth, and so you have a ramification of history. And at the same time, you play it into and you bridge it with the prophets of old. So you take the protagonists of the people who have been sidelined by Marcion. So no prophetics, no Torah, but also no prophets who have any bearing on this new Christian movement. It's just the one great prophet, as he says, who is Jesus. So all prophets of old, with the last being John the Baptist, they're all out, yeah. Which doesn't mean he's against those, yeah. He just thinks they are not our business. It's the business of that community which stays with them. We don't accuse them. They're not bad people. They have their Torah and they do follow the prophetic and apocalyptic elements, but that's theirs. It's not ours. And he builds his own vision on, and just like a negative portfolio, a positive portfolio, but not in the sense of ethical negative, but just a photographic negative, just as a counterexample, an antithesis in this view. So I think when we compare the two texts, and I do that quite thoroughly, I think, hopefully, we can see literal parallels and differences. So almost like a synoptic reading between the Ascension Isaiah and the Gospel of Marcion. And what I'm then claiming is, particularly with regards to the birth stories, is that the Ascension is just one more synoptic text, which we should include in our synoptic readings, in addition to Marcion's text. So we not only have 5 Gospels, but with these particular passages, we have even a further text which we can compare and see how texts are being used and remodeled, almost like brick stones when you play with Lego. Yeah, you take the stones which are around and you build new imaginary scenarios with those texts.
We've got a couple of super... Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think it's back in 1956, if I'm not mistaken, in Van Unnik in an essay pointed out 4 or 5 striking parallels between the Ascension of Isaiah and this document I was talking about, the Apocryphon of James, But one of them is, in fact, that the Ascension of Isaiah refers to the resurrection of Jesus after 3 days. And then the Latin, I forget what the Ethiopic text says, but I do recall the Latin, iste mundo. He will remain in that world, which I take to mean the world of the ascent, for 545 days, right? So 545 plus 3, 548 takes you to the first of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, the actual day of Rosh Hashanah, right? And so, and another document, another essay, forgive me, I forget the author's name, but this is a 2020 article, I believe, came out arguing for the dependence of the canonical letter of James on 2nd Enoch. And the reason I bring that up is because there do appear a lot of parallels between the Ascension of Isaiah and 2nd Enoch. And so I think the Apocryphon of James, right, has this very rabbinic-like concept that prophecy has ceased. It's unrabbinic in the sense, of course, that according to that document, prophecy has ceased with John the Baptizer, but it's still overlapping with the rabbinic idea that in the current age, right, there are no prophets, right? And so I think that's another important overlap. And I have a couple friends in Germany who their first impression was that the Apocryphon of James is probably Marcionite. I don't really see it, but it's not that important. But it is fascinating how many of these early documents are playing off of each other.
Well, look, when we talk about Marcionites, I've pointed out quite a number of times also the close relations between Marcion and the rabbis, the later rabbis. One of the most stunning features, of course, their common belief in resurrection. So when we're talking about Marcionites, we're not talking about non-Jews. I once wrote in the first journal issue of the Journal of Judaism, of ancient Judaism, it's called, right? It's edited by Mimuni. And in the very first issue, I have an article which says Marcion the Jew. And I'll tell you that. First of all, if we admit what we've said before today, that these isms and ities didn't exist, there was no Christianity before Marcion, how could he be a Christian? The only thing he could have been was a Jew. And we don't know of anybody else in the first 200 years who knows so much about Jewish literature as Marcion does without being a Jew. It would be unprecedented. So the only cultural background he could have had is being a Jew. Right. And Tertullian mocks him about being one of the newcomers in Judaism. So he might have come from whatever family which was related to Jews in Sinope or the north of Cappadocia. But what I'm trying to point out is the many, many elements. I mean, orientation to Scripture, knowledge about Scripture, knowledge about the law, the impact law has on his thinking. When Tertullian wants to focus his thinking, he talks about the new, and that's why I took that as the title of my new book. He talks about the Edictum Christi, about the Torah of Christ. And when he talks about Paul and comments about Paul, Tertullian, he talks about the new edict of Christ. And that's why I call the new book Christ's Torah. That's not saying that Marcion is not part of that Jewish tradition. He is as much part of that Jewish tradition as he is critical with the rabbis of this type of propheticism, because they don't like too much the prophets. They like practice, legal practice, and explanation of legal practice. And that's exactly what he does. So we should not disentangle. If he wants to disentangle Jews and Christians, that's he does, because he does it from a Jewish perspective.
Yeah, so Marcion also recognizes that Jesus did not fulfill the Jewish prophecies, the scriptural prophecies for the Messiah.
He's opposed to that. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
That's his claim, that Jesus hasn't come. No, he's like any good Jewish rabbi, a new Moses. I mean, he's doing his own thing.
Yes.
That's
Did he have an idea of two messiahs, like one for Jews, and then
Of course,
something an
in
analog for Gentiles?
Absolutely. I mean, not only for Gentiles. That's the interesting thing, and maybe that was what later impacted massively on Christians. The problem he has, and which he spells out according to Tertullian, is that he says there are two messiahs. One which wants to restore the state of Israel, whatever my status state, yeah. Maybe it's the political status of Israel. That's the political Messiah, and that's embedded in the Bar Kochba Messiah. And then he says, then there is this other Christ, our Christ, and he has come to rescue everybody, not only the nations, not only the Greeks, also the Jews. And that's why he has this example of the cloth and of the wine skins, yeah, where he says,
right.
and that's only preserved in Marcion's Gospel and not in Luke, where he says, if you put on a new cloth on an old cloth, then both will end up being destroyed. And in order to preserve both, you have to do it the other way around. So his interest is to preserve both Jews and those new Jews who he sees as followers of Christ. So he doesn't want to destroy the Torah. He doesn't want to destroy any form of Jewish practice. He just thinks it's no longer his practice. So
Right.
he's a typical creator of a new kind of synagogue.
Got it.
Who is not rejecting the others.
To be a little bit of an advocatus diaboli here, isn't that saying a bit, I don't know how to call it, inconsistent, illogical? Look, old wine is the best. There's no one on the planet. If you give them the choice, you want to drink some new wine or some old wine, you're going to go for the old wine. So isn't that a very odd adaptation?
No, that is only, this sentence that the old one is the best is only preserved in Luke. That's Luke's response.
I know, but I'm saying just as human beings, everyone will prefer the old wine to new wine. If you give it the choice, it's the new wine tastes better.
Well, I think that's even a reflection of all antique people, and that was the big problem people like Marcion have, and that's why Marcionism didn't survive. People in antiquity, like Eusebius, were claiming the older the better, and honestly, the older we get, we also think the older the better. I mean, that's the problem of human nature, right? Jacob is a bit younger than us, right? So we talk more than him. But that's the problem with tradition, yeah. And people who claimed novelty, so the avant-gardes, had a difficult and a very hard time today. They have a very hard time today, but they have had an even harder time in the first and in the second centuries.
I can imagine, yeah.
And this I think was one of the main reasons, just a psychological and sociological reason, why this kind of an obsession with novelty. Wolfram Kinzig has written his habilitation about novelty in the ancient church, so from 0 to 400 to Eusebius roughly, and he follows that small line of people who were avant-gardes and who claimed that novelty is more valuable than tradition. They hardly made it, and there were always drawbacks, and tradition always prevailed. So Tertullian, I think, at the end, had the game and won the trophy. Neither Jesus nor Paul nor Marcion.
We're gonna catch up on some super chats here. Amos Woodenberg, thank you for another super chat. Is it correct to characterize the development of Rabbinic Judaism as a focal point of spiritual counterweight against Roman Hellenistic imperialism, inevitably in conflict with Romanized Christianity?
I think that there are inherently, I think when we look at Christianity as we have, and there are many Jewish authorities that have pointed this out. There are elements within what we call New Testament Christianity, which are simply not just un-Jewish, but anti-Jewish. One of the most famous examples was how Paul and Christians utilize blood, the consumption of blood, which is totally anathema to Torah respecting Jews. There are Christians by the 2nd century are symbolizing Jesus in what can only be regarded as graven images. There is, in my view, a sharp distinction. Christianity is veering off in its own, that's why it's its own religion. It's sharply veering off in its own distinct way. It's talking about a man God. Across the board, Christianity is what's keying off of and developing what I think were perceived as narrow sectarian ideas in previous Judaism. You hear Roman writers talk about what's wrong with Judaism in the Greco-Roman mindset. They're haters of all mankind. They're sectarian. They stick to themselves. They're hard to socialize with. They don't eat with us because they got their own special dietary rules, and et cetera, et cetera. And Christianity appears to almost go down the list of the things that Romans find objectionable about Judaism and its inability to integrate and assimilate in Greco-Roman society. And so, yeah, kosher diet, we can check that. And, well, gee, after all, circumcision, says Paul, that's really not necessary. It seems like systematically the very objections to Judaism, and in particular, paradoxically, even Messianic Judaism, are being scratched out of Judaism by Christian authors, so that we're getting a form of Messianic Judaism that is much more accommodated to Greco-Roman tastes. So I would say the causality in my mind works that way. Now, is there feedback causality? Does later rabbinic Judaism itself sort of react to Christianity? To some degree, I think so, but to a lesser degree. I mostly see Christianity as a Greco-Roman ization of Messianic Judaism rather than the other way about. I don't know if that answered the question.
Let's take a look at the next one. Stephen, the storyteller, thank you for the super chat. Does anyone agree on the theory about Mark's use of the Gospel of Thomas? If so, when would you date the Gospel of Thomas?
Right. No, the Gospel of Thomas, as we have it, is a Gnosticized, highly Gnostic thing. I would have a hard time swallowing that Mark was influenced by the Gospel of Thomas. Now, that is not to say that Mark could have been composed. People have said, well, why didn't Mark contain any of what was the so-called Q saying? That does not imply that those sayings did not exist at the time of Mark. It's just that they weren't part of Mark's purpose. There could have been a version of those sayings floating about, but Mark didn't need to use them. I don't think Mark's ignorance of them proves that the weren't sayings of Jesus floating about. But in the version of Thomas, no. Thomas's version, I don't think influenced Mark.
I'm still not fully decided because, as James was saying, the Gospel of Thomas is certainly a translated text. We have it only in Coptic. We certainly have it in certain redactional form. Until today, I think nobody has really worked out the structure of this gospel, whether it's being grouped a bit like Evarcharis later writes a text, cut it out, throws it in the winds, and then collects it again and puts it together. So in order to have a kind of a riddle text, in the pure sense, so that only the Gnostic knows the trail through the various stories, which could be. So there are various, I think, possibilities to look at this text, but the text is certainly a revised version of earlier forms of this text. Now, how this text, at which stage this text interfered with other texts, I'm not absolutely sure. But what I suggested in my books and what I'm trying to rework again is the claim, and we have talked about it in previous sessions already, that it seems better to understand the relation between these texts, not in a genealogical way. So Mark is using Thomas. Thomas is using whatever. So we have lines of genealogy. A is the source of B, B the source of C, C is the source of D. It rather looks like that we are talking about a milieu of writing where these people, like the five of us now here on screen, we all know each other. Of course, we write books, but the next books that I'm writing, I can't write without Richard, Samuel's, James, and Jacob's questions in mind, and your questions. So Stephen will be part of my next book, and anybody else who has asked questions, and that's the way we counter interfere in our own thinking. And God knows the poor people who in 150 years' time want to separate out which idea came from Richard or from James or from Jacob, Samuel, or somebody else. So this is what in codicology we call cross-contamination. Counter-contamination, cross-contamination. By reading one thing, I have in mind the other people's thing. And then I start to integrate. And what results then at a certain stage is what we have as the Gospel of Thomas. Maybe there are 5 different Gospels of Thomas, which we still are going to find different ways. A phenomenal example is, for example, the Testament of the Patriarchs, which we have in several stages and several versions. Or we go to the text of Oignostus in the Nag Hammadi texts. We have a completely non-Christianized text version, which seems to be a Platonic text, and we have a Christianized version of it. Yeah. So in the same collection, 2 different reductions of the same text. Now, which reduction has interfered with what is so difficult to work out. But when we come to no longer thinking of genealogies of text, but of writing milieus and communities like us today, then I think we come more closely to, if we want, to sort of historical realities of text emendation and text development.
Yes, an important question for me is, for instance, more important than the dating is how some of the unique ideas in the Gospel of Thomas got in there. And I'm referring again to Judaic traditions, right?
Yeah.
And just one example is that for scholars, the famous 13th Logion, where Jesus takes Thomas apart, tells him something, and later the other 2 disciples asked, "What did Jesus tell you?" He said, "Well, if I told you anything that he told me, right, the fire, you would pick up stones to stone me, fire would come out of the stones to consume you." Well,
Yeah.
right, anyone who's read Hagiga, the Talmudic treatise, sees Hagiga right away, because there it's told that you cannot teach the mysteries of the deeds of the Merkava, right? Not to 3, not to 2, and not to 1, unless that 1, right, is self-motivated, right? They teach themselves, right? And so then later after this, we see that those who are not prepared to study the mysteries of the Merkava, but who go ahead and do it, fire falls from the sky to burn them. So it's similar to the same situation that we find actually in the Mishnah, and then in the rest of the treatise in Hagigah. So where did that come from? To me, that's a more interesting idea than the genealogical obsession, which text has influenced this text. So where did this come out? Because one could conceive of the idea that, yes, Mark is earlier, doesn't have any Merkava mysticism in it, but perhaps some kind of Merkava ideas were circulating in the Jesus movement among some members before Mark was written. And so sometimes these later documents actually are now bringing forth some ideas that may be earlier than some of the contents of this later literature, as sort of a protest. Look, we have a memory. We have a memory of a tradition. We don't see it exactly the way you do. So we're writing our writings. We use yours to build up the main part of the text, but then we're injecting our own memory, at least according to traditional claims. So this is far more interesting than the genealogical obsession for me.
Very important remarks, Sarah. Thanks.
I think so too.
Great remarks. Yeah.
It was current one local church. They're going to want to include it in some form, even if it's just morally preserved one in some form. No. You guys missed out on this over here. No. You guys missed that out on over there. I think, we have to think of exactly the term Chicago.
Let's take a look at the next one here. Paul Kickling again. Thanks for another super chat. Jesus claimed to be the figure in Hebrews 1:3, which before Christianity, Enoch came in contact, became this being. The Gospels are genius literature because it perfectly fulfills Scripture. Who wants to go first?
I'll introduce this. I'll let others speak, but this goes back to Marcion and his angelic, what would you call it, Jesusology. But the idea of Jesus being an angelic figure, this is actually quite Jewish, quite Enochic, because in the parables of Enoch, the Messiah is actually a heavenly entity. Now, we're never told how this Messiah is going to get to earth. We're not told that, but it is a heavenly entity. And although there's some exegetical difference, the difference of interpretation, right? It does appear to me that, according to the text, the human being Enoch sees this figure, which is called the Son of Man, the Messiah. There are many titles given, and then at the end, Enoch ascends to heaven and is told, "You are that Son of Man." So somehow Enoch is the Son of Man that he's been seeing all of this time. Now, as I said, not everyone agrees with that interpretation of the parables of Enoch, but I think that in early Christian texts, what we call early Christian texts, we do see evidence, possible evidence for this understanding of the parables of Enoch. That, yes, Jesus is being thought of as this heavenly entity, right, which is, for all intents and purposes, angelic, right? And of course, the subject of the angelomorphic Christ, right, is quite popular the last several decades as well.
Of course, one has to say that Hebrews had a difficult time amongst the early Christians to be accepted amongst the accepted writings. So when you put here together, he would say the Gospels are genius literature because it perfectly fulfills Scripture. I would differentiate between Hebrews and the Gospels. I mean, Hebrews, as people sometimes say, are the least Pauline letters in the New Testament, probably less Pauline than the letter of James or Jude, yeah, because there's so much Jewish background and Jewish tradition, as just being explained here, with regards to Jewish mystical tradition and others, which is in Hebrews, which you hardly get in the Gospels and hardly get in the Pauline texts, which brings us back to the point which I've made also some time ago, that the Gospels are in fact literature which are pretty close to Pauline writings. Even more so, if my theory is correct, that the Pauline letters as we have them today are in a redacted form, which presuppose the gospel literature in the New Testament, so that we have a harmonization between Paul's final redacted letters as we have them, amongst which them are Hebrews, of course, at the end, and the Gospels. So there is a relation with which what we call the canonical redaction has been creating between those letters like Hebrews and the Gospels. And in that respect, your claim just to mix them together here is not too far from the collection as we have them today. Because if we talk about New Testament, of course, we have a New Testament which starts with the Gospels and which finishes with the last touch Paul has put to his letter collection, which he makes the statements in Hebrews.
Let's take a look at this next super chat, and after that, I will ask my final question, and we'll close out. Paul Kickling again, thanks for another super chat. Scripture itself was a test to claimants. If you can perfectly uphold these demands, you cannot challenge our perception of God. Challenge accepted, see Christianity as an act of intellectual one-upmanship. Who wants to take on the question first?
I want to hear more from Dr. Bob. What do you think of that, Dr. Price?
Dr. Price?
I'm trying to construe the question.
Okay, take your time.
These demands. Is this like, are there questions or problems in Scripture that are puzzles that need to be solved, or one cannot make the claim of having a definitive knowledge of God? I'm not quite sure what this means.
I myself,
well,
I'm having a hard time understanding.
Tradition as it emerged, especially after the period of the wars, was basically turned. I don't mean to be at all insulting when I say it like this. In Judaism, into a debating society. The basic idea is, for any one text in the Torah, you get 3 rabbis and 5 opinions. And so, is there a continuous tradition of, exegetical interpretation that's going on, so that within the Christian movement, you've got to, this is my take on this, or this is at least my allegorical take on that, and so forth. I think that was the thrust of the question.
Yes, but I would say, though, that the 5 opinions among the 3 rabbis, though, would not be quote unquote theoretical, but they would be all revolving around questions, for instance, practical questions of halakha, right? So it wouldn't be abstruse theological means or tropes such as you find frequently in some forms of Christianity. It's like.
But is the question or the statement, rather than the question which is being put to us, is that not more a reflection about 21st or maybe 19th century thinking, rather than a reflection about antique thinking? Because when it talks about Scripture being a test to claimant, we take for granted today that the core of religious practice, like Jewish practice and Christian practice, was centered around Scripture. That's the impression that statement makes.
Right.
And I think this is pretty wrong.
Yeah, it's almost Protestant in its,
practice came first, out of practice, and practice was not always referenced to Scripture. Practice was first. At best, it was to legal debates or legal institutions, right, which were based on Torah relevant literature, but it was certainly not the reference point, and the test was not a kind of corpus of scriptures. The test was rather daily practice, and the challenge was not the Scripture; it was the other way around. Right. Daily problems were the challenges that claimed to be right or wrong. I mean, you walked the left door and you were either right or wrong, and you had a challenge to choose between the 2 doors. Yeah, and then the reference was not going back to scriptures and whether there was anything about a door, right? But the challenge was how do I get through one of these bloody doors, right? And without making a mistake, right? So the praxis was the challenge, not the scripture. The scripture was sometimes a help. Quite often, it was no help. Tradition was often a help, relatively rare. Most of the time, it was more a problem than a solution. And so you turn to authorities. These authorities were hardly a solution, but most of the time self-serving problems. And so it was the daily challenge, and which was the test, not scriptures.
What a great answer that was, gentlemen. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is relevant, but somehow I think so. I've thought more than once about the parallel I see between Marcionism's occurrence and impact in the growth of the Christian tradition and that of the Buddha in Indian religious tradition.
Very good.
Here you've got a heavily scriptural tradition, though very diverse. There are, at least now, there's 6 contradictory but orthodox schools of Hinduism. Fascinating. I love that. And they're all interpreting scripture. But here comes Prince Siddhartha, who affirms the religious worldview. In fact, in the Passing Sights legend, it's the Hindu deities that awaken Prince Siddhartha to his destiny. He says, look, there's something even we are missing that the poor mortals need. We need you to find it. So snap out of it. And so he then sees it and beneath the Bodhi tree and says, I've got it. And it's a revelation that enables him to not exactly deny scripture, because he still believes. He says, you want to pray to the gods for good weather and a good harvest? Go ahead, they'll probably answer you. But they don't know what it takes to be saved spiritually, to be liberated. I do know that, lucky me. So I'm not negating that, but going beyond it. And we don't really need the scriptures like the later Zen thing where the monk rips up the scripture because it worked. It told him what he needed to know, so he doesn't need it anymore. So in Buddhism, they've rejected the Hindu canon, though they don't mind if you follow it. And they're saying, however, we are the next step of revelation and a superior one, and even the gods need what we have to offer because they're the ones who told me. And so what happens when, of course, it's part of this larger awakening with the Upanishad writers and so on as well. But they hear it from the sages in the woods, but part of the same movement, and they hear, oh, you mean sacrifices don't really avail? That the real Brahman that we think we're conjuring up is inside us? And that's what we have to sacrifice? That doesn't sound half bad. But boy, I hate to repudiate the Holy Scriptures. So a lot of them went back and said, I bet if you read the old Vedas the right way, allegorically, it will attest to this new view of things. And so you had, I think, almost exactly the kind of thing with Marcion as being like the Buddha. Okay, that's okay, but that's behind us, and the so-called Jewish Christians, but especially the Catholics, saying, yeah, we're on the new bandwagon, but boy, I don't want to just put the Judaism and the Old Testament out to the curb. There must be some way of finding the new thing in the old thing. We can still say it's a new revelation because we never saw it in there before, but now we do, thanks to the new thing. And so you have the Buddhism carries on like Marcionite Christianity, and Orthodox Hinduism is much like Catholicism, absorbing things but keeping the same old center of gravity. And that's, to me, that's not some sort of weird miracle or something. It's just like Bauer saw. There's this sort of, quote, Hegelian progress of ideas and their reactions and their assimilations. It just is a beautiful spectacle to me.
Right.
Well, it's a fantastic, I think it's a fantastic parallel. Absolutely. And we should not forget that in those times, I mean, Buddha was known in Alexandria. There were Buddhist communities in the first, second centuries of our time. So it was not uncommon to know that this time of a rebel figure can initiate a new form of the old religion by disparaging the old, and creating the new. And what you described is pretty much the reaction we have in Justin, who then takes it on and develops a kind of reintegration of the old by at the same time elevating the new to an exclusivism which you will not find in the same way in Marcion.
Yeah, fascinating.
Can I just thank you guys, because what a joy it is to just with three such highly intelligent, insightful, and well-informed men such as yourselves. What a true.
Well, thanks so much for all of you. Yeah,
Jacob, but this, I love with these guys, and it is a joy to meet you, Dr. Zinner, at long last. As I say, you directed me to find some articles and scholarship that is, I think, having an influence on me right now. So you guys, thank you very much. This was
thanks to all of you. Yeah.
Jacob really deserves a lot of credit for shouldering this kind of thing and creating these events.
Thank you.
Berman, you are doing, I may put it this way, the Lord's work.
Yeah.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.